Danny Rodriguez wiped the sweat from his forehead and checked his watch. 3 in the morning. The night shift on the Aurora's Edge was always quiet, but tonight felt different somehow. He had been working on ships for 20 years, and after all that time you learn to trust your gut feelings about these things. He walked down the narrow corridor toward Section C7, his toolbox rattling softly with each step. The ship's environmental systems needed their daily check, just like every other night for the past 2 years since he had been assigned to this flagship. Most people thought his job was boring. Check the air recyclers, test the water filters, make sure everyone could breathe and drink safely. Danny never minded being overlooked. It meant he could do his work in peace. The Aurora's Edge was the biggest ship in the human fleet. Admiral Patricia Hayes commanded from the bridge high above, making decisions that affected entire star systems. Colonel Jake Morrison led the Marines, tough soldiers who everyone respected and feared. Danny knew their names because everyone knew their names, but he doubted they knew his. His personnel file said he was competent, but unremarkable. Danny had seen it once when he was updating his medical records. The words had stung a little, but he understood why they wrote it. He never caused trouble, never asked for promotions, never made waves. He just did his job and went home to his small quarters to read books about old Earth and write letters to his sister back on Mars Colony. Tonight, the ship was stationed near the border between human space and Keltharian territory. The Keltharians were tall, gray-skinned aliens who had built an empire by conquering other species. For months now, both sides had been watching each other, waiting to see who would make the first move. Danny tried not to think about politics and war. His job was to keep the air clean and the water flowing, no matter what happened outside the ship. He reached the environmental control room for Section C7 and pulled out his tablet to check the readings. Everything looked normal at first glance. Oxygen levels good, carbon dioxide within acceptable ranges, temperature steady. But something caught his eye. The carbon dioxide was reading 0.3% higher than usual. Not enough to set off alarms, not enough for the computer to flag as a problem, but Danny had been reading these numbers for so long that even tiny changes jumped out at him. He frowned and checked the reading again. Still high. Maybe one of the recyclers was working a little, slower than normal. It happened sometimes. Parts wore out, filters got dirty, machines got old. Danny made a note to check the recycler in the morning and started to move on to the next section. But something made him stop. In 20 years of maintaining life support systems, he had learned that small problems often meant bigger problems were hiding nearby. A 0.3% increase in carbon dioxide could mean someone was breathing in Section C7 who should not be there. Danny put down his toolbox and pulled out a small handheld scanner. The device could detect heat signatures through walls, though it only worked for short distances. He pointed it toward the corridor that led deeper into Section C7 and slowly swept it back and forth. 3 heat signatures. Moving carefully, trying to stay quiet, Danny's heart started beating faster. Section C7 was supposed to be empty at this time of night. The storage rooms and maintenance areas in that part of the ship were only used during day shift. No one had any reason to be there now, especially not 3 people moving around like they were trying not to be seen. He thought about calling security, but something held him back. If these were Keltharian infiltrators, they probably had ways to listen to human communications. They might have already taken over parts of the ship's computer system. Danny had heard stories about how the Keltharians had defeated other species by learning everything about them first, then striking at exactly the right moment to cause maximum damage. Instead, Danny quietly picked up his toolbox and started moving toward Section C7. He knew these corridors better than almost anyone on the ship. Every pipe, every vent, every maintenance hatch. If someone was in his section who should not be there, he wanted to know who they were and what they were doing. The corridors in Section C7 were dimly lit during night shift to save power. Danny moved slowly, stopping every few steps to listen. He could hear soft footsteps ahead of him, and occasionally a whispered word in a language he did not recognize. Definitely not human crew members. Danny found a maintenance hatch that led into the ventilation system and quietly opened it. The space was cramped, but he had crawled through these ducts hundreds of times to repair air circulation systems. He left his toolbox behind and squeezed into the narrow passage, moving toward where he had detected the heat signatures. Through a ventilation grate, Danny could see 3 figures in dark clothing moving through one of the storage rooms. They were tall and thin, with gray skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Keltharians. They were attaching small devices to power conduits and computer terminals, working with practiced efficiency. Danny watched them for several minutes, trying to understand what they were doing. The devices looked like some kind of computer equipment, probably designed to give them access to the ship's systems. If they could get into the Aurora's Edge's computers, they could disable weapons, shut down life support, or open the docking bays to let in more infiltrators. One of the Keltharians spoke in their own language, and another responded with what sounded like confirmation. They seemed satisfied with their work and started moving toward the next room. Danny realized they were probably planning to install these devices throughout the ship, taking control of critical systems one section at a time. He had to do something, but what? He was just a maintenance worker with no military training and no weapons. The Keltharians were trained soldiers with advanced technology. If he tried to fight them directly, they would kill him in seconds. But Danny knew something they did not know. He understood how this ship worked better than anyone except, maybe the chief engineer. Every system, every backup, every way that power and information moved through the Aurora's Edge. The Keltharians might be able to attach their devices to human equipment, but they probably did not understand how that equipment really functioned. Danny quietly crawled back through the ventilation system to where he had left his toolbox. He pulled out his tablet and started looking at the ship's systems from a different perspective. Instead of checking to make sure everything was working properly, he started thinking about how to make things stop working in very specific ways. The Keltharians were attaching their devices to power conduits, so they needed electricity to function. But power systems on starships were complicated, with multiple backups and safety systems. If Danny was very careful, he could create power fluctuations that would look like normal equipment failures but would actually disrupt whatever the Keltharians were trying to do. He started with section C7, making tiny adjustments to power routing. That would cause irregular voltage spikes. The changes were so small that the ship's computers would not notice them, but any sensitive electronic equipment in that area would start malfunctioning. The Keltharian devices would probably stop working, and with luck, they would think the ship's electrical systems were just unreliable. Danny worked quietly for the next hour, moving through maintenance areas and making subtle changes to power, distribution, air circulation, and computer network routing. He was careful to make everything look like normal maintenance work, in case anyone checked the logs later. Just a night shift worker doing his job, testing systems, and making minor adjustments. By 4 a.m, Danny had sabotaged power systems in 3 sections where he suspected the Keltharians might be working. He had also sent a coded message through the ship's internal maintenance network to other night shift workers, using technical language that would sound like normal work reports but would actually warn them to watch for unusual activity. As he finished his shift and headed back to his quarters, Danny realized that his life had just changed completely. He was no longer just a maintenance worker keeping the ship running. He was now part of a war that most people on the ship did not even know had started. But that was okay. Danny had always been good at being overlooked. Danny spent the next 3 days thinking about what he had seen in Section C7. The Keltharian infiltrators had not returned to that area, probably because their devices kept malfunctioning due to the power fluctuations he had created. But he knew they were still somewhere on the ship, probably trying to find other ways to take control of critical systems. He decided he needed help, but not from the official security teams. If the Keltharians had infiltrated the Aurora's Edge so easily, they probably had ways of monitoring security communications and troop movements. Danny needed to reach people who worked in the shadows like he did, people who knew the ship's hidden spaces and forgotten corners. Amy Foster worked the night shift in communications, monitoring routine transmissions between human colonies and ships. She was a quiet woman in her 30s who had been doing the same job for 8 years. Most people forgot she existed because her work happened when everyone else was sleeping. Danny had only talked to her a few times in the ship's cafeteria, but he remembered that she paid attention to details that others missed. Danny found Amy in the communications center at 2 in the morning, sitting in front of multiple screens showing data streams from across human space. She looked up when he entered, surprised to see anyone at that hour. "Hey, Amy," Danny said, trying to sound casual. "I need to ask you something, and it might sound crazy." Amy pushed back from her console and studied his face. "You look worried, Danny. What's going on?" Danny sat down next to her and spoke quietly. "Have you noticed anything strange in the communication logs over the past few days? Messages that don't quite make sense or data patterns that seem off?" Amy thought for a moment. "Actually, yes. There have been some weird signal spikes in sections of the ship that normally don't generate much electronic activity. I thought it might be equipment problems, but the patterns are too regular for random malfunctions." Danny felt relief wash over him. Amy had noticed the same things he had, just from a different perspective. "I think we have uninvited guests on the ship," he said. "The kind that don't want to be found." Amy's eyes widened, but she did not panic. Instead, she turned back to her screens and started pulling up data from the past week. "Show me where you think they might be," she said. For the next hour, Danny and Amy compared his maintenance logs with her communication data. The pattern became clear. Wherever Danny had detected unusual carbon dioxide levels or heard strange sounds, Amy had recorded electronic interference and unauthorized data transmissions. The Keltharians were definitely on the ship, and they were spreading throughout multiple sections. "We need to tell someone," Amy said. Danny shook his head. "If they're smart enough to get past all our security, they're probably monitoring official channels. We need to be smarter than they are." Amy understood immediately. "You want to fight them without them knowing we're fighting them." "Exactly. And I think I know other people who can help." Danny's next stop was the cargo bay, where Nick Chen worked the night shift managing supply deliveries and inventory. Nick was a careful man who noticed when things were out of place, even tiny things that most people would ignore. Danny found him checking shipping containers that had arrived from a supply depot near the Keltharian border. "Nick, I need to talk to you about something important," Danny said. Nick looked around to make sure they were alone, then gestured for Danny to follow him to a quiet corner of the cargo bay. "Is this about the strange power fluctuations in the storage areas? I've been getting reports about equipment problems all week." Danny smiled. Nick had noticed too. "It's bigger than equipment problems. I think someone is trying to take over the ship's systems, and they're starting with the areas that security doesn't watch closely." Nick nodded slowly. "That would explain why some of my inventory scanners have been acting up. The problems always happen in sections that are supposed to be empty." He paused. "You think it's Keltharians?" "I know it is. I saw them." Nick's expression became serious. "What do you want to do about it?" Danny explained his plan to create system failures that would disrupt the infiltrators' equipment without alerting them that humans knew they were there. Nick immediately understood how he could help. The cargo bay systems were connected to power distribution throughout the ship, and Nick knew exactly which circuits controlled which areas. "I can create power surges that look like routine equipment." "Testing," Nick said. "If I time them right with your maintenance work, we can make their devices fail constantly." Their final recruit was Kate Thompson, a medical orderly who worked night shifts in the ship's hospital. Kate was responsible for monitoring patient vital signs and managing medical supplies when the doctors and nurses were sleeping. Danny found her in the medical supply room checking inventory on medication that had been requested by colonies throughout human space. "Kate, I need your help with something that might sound strange," Danny began. Kate looked up from her tablet. "Strange? How? Have you noticed any unusual medical requests lately? Requests for medications or equipment that don't match normal usage patterns?" Kate frowned. "Actually, yes. There have been several requests for medications that are used to treat injuries from energy weapons. But we haven't been in any combat situations recently." She paused. "There have also been requests for medical scanners that can detect non-human biology." Danny felt his heart sink. The medical requests meant that someone was preparing for fighting, and the biological scanner suggested that the Keltharians were planning something that required them to identify humans quickly and accurately. He explained what he and the others had discovered about the infiltrators. Kate listened carefully, asking questions about timing and locations. When Danny finished, Kate was quiet for a long moment. "They're planning something big," she said finally. "The medical supplies they've requested would be enough to treat casualties from a major battle. But the requests are spread out over time and sent to different medical stations, so no one would notice the pattern unless they were looking for it." Danny realized that Kate's access to medical logistics gave them a view of Keltharian preparations that no one else had. "Can you tell what they're planning?" Kate pulled up her medical supply database and started cross-referencing requests with locations and timing. After several minutes, she looked up with a grim expression. "Based on the medical supplies they're gathering, I think they're planning to attack multiple human colonies at the same time. The Aurora's Edge is probably just one target among many." Danny felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. They were not just dealing with infiltrators on one ship. This was the beginning of a larger war, and somehow he and his small team of overlooked workers had stumbled onto intelligence that could save thousands of lives. Over the next several days, Danny, Amy, Nick, and Kate developed what they called the Quiet Protocol. Each of them would continue doing their normal jobs, but they would also quietly sabotage Keltharian operations, using their access to ship systems that security teams rarely monitored. Amy began introducing subtle interference into communication, channels that the Keltharians were using to coordinate with their forces outside the ship. The interference looked like normal electronic noise, but it was carefully designed to corrupt data transmissions at critical moments. Nick started creating power fluctuations in cargo bay systems that would disrupt any Keltharian equipment stored in those areas. He also began tracking supply requests that might indicate enemy preparations, building a database of suspicious activity that could help predict their next moves. Kate continued monitoring medical supply requests while also introducing small delays and misdirections into medical logistics systems. If the Keltharians were planning major attacks, she could slow down their preparations by making it harder for them to get the medical supplies they needed. Danny coordinated their efforts, while continuing his systematic sabotage of ship systems. He had become an expert at creating technical problems that would frustrate enemy operations without being obvious enough to trigger security investigations. The four of them met every few nights in different locations throughout the ship, always during times when they would normally be working alone. They shared information about Keltharian activities and planned their next actions. To anyone watching, they were just night shift workers doing their jobs. But Danny knew they were fighting a war that most people on the ship did not even realize had started. And somehow, 4 overlooked humans were holding their own against an enemy that had conquered entire star systems. The strangest part was that their success depended entirely on remaining invisible. The moment anyone noticed what they were doing, they would lose their greatest advantage. They were dangerous precisely because no one expected them to be dangerous. As Danny finished another night of quiet sabotage and headed back to his quarters, he realized that the war had already begun. The Keltharians thought they were fighting humans, but they were actually fighting something much more difficult to defeat. They were fighting the people who kept human civilization running, and those people had no intention of giving up. 2 weeks after Danny first discovered the Keltharian infiltrators, the war began in earnest. But it did not start the way anyone expected. At 600 hours, Admiral Hayes received intelligence reports that Keltharian fleets were massing near the borders of human space. Within hours, similar reports came from colonies across 17 star systems. The Keltharians were preparing for what looked like a coordinated assault on multiple human worlds at the same time. Danny was checking atmospheric processors in Section D12 when the ship went to battle stations. Red lights flashed in the corridors, and the intercom crackled with orders for all crew members to report to their emergency positions. But Danny did not go to his assigned battle station. Instead, he made his way to a small maintenance room where he had arranged to meet with Amy, Nick, and Kate. "This is it," Amy said when the 4 of them were together. "All the Keltharian communication traffic I've been monitoring has suddenly increased. They're coordinating something big." Nick nodded grimly. "I've been tracking supply movements for..." The past week, medical supplies, weapons components, and communication equipment have been moving to staging areas throughout human space. They've been planning this for months. Kate looked worried. The medical requests I've been monitoring suggest they expect heavy casualties. But not just from space battles. They're preparing for ground combat on multiple worlds. Danny felt a cold knot form in his stomach. How many worlds? At least 20, Kate replied. Maybe more. The pattern suggests they're planning to attack every major human colony at the same time. Danny realized that what they had discovered on the Aurora's edge was just a small part of a much larger operation. The Keltharians were not just infiltrating one ship. They had been quietly preparing for a war that would affect millions of humans across the galaxy. We need to do something, Amy said. But what can 4 people do against an entire alien empire? Danny had been thinking about that question for days. We can't stop their fleets or their armies, but we can make sure their plans don't work the way they expect them to. He explained what he had learned about Keltharian tactics from studying their infiltration of the Aurora's edge. The aliens were incredibly good at gathering intelligence and making detailed plans, but they were not good at adapting when things went wrong. They expected their operations to work exactly as planned, and they became confused and ineffective when faced with unexpected problems. They've spent months learning about our military forces, our weapons, and our defenses, Danny said. But they don't understand how our civilization really works. They don't know about people like us. Over the next several hours, while the Aurora's edge prepared for battle, Danny and his team implemented what they called the network protocol. Using their access to ship systems and their connections with other overlooked workers throughout human space, they began coordinating a resistance effort that existed completely outside official military channels. Amy contacted night shift communication operators on other ships and space stations using technical maintenance codes that sounded like routine system checks but actually carried intelligence about Keltharian positions and movements. Within hours, a hidden communication network was operating across human space, invisible to both human military command and Keltharian intelligence services. Nick reached out to cargo supervisors and supply managers throughout the human colonies, using shipping manifests and inventory reports to coordinate the movement of critical supplies away from areas where Keltharian attacks were expected. To anyone monitoring the communications, it looked like normal logistics work, but it was actually a coordinated effort to deny the aliens the resources they planned to capture. Kate established contact with medical personnel across multiple star systems, using patient transfer requests and medical supply orders to share intelligence about Keltharian biological weapons and medical preparations. Her network could track alien movements by monitoring requests for specific medications and medical equipment. Danny coordinated all of these efforts while continuing his sabotage of ship systems. But now, he was not just targeting the Aurora's edge. Through maintenance networks and technical support channels, he was helping workers on other ships and stations implement similar sabotage efforts. The beauty of their approach was that it was completely invisible to enemy intelligence. The Keltharians had spent months mapping human military hierarchies, government structures, and communication networks, but they had never bothered to study the networks of ordinary workers who kept human civilization functioning. When the Keltharian assault began, their forces encountered something unprecedented in their history of conquest. Their detailed intelligence was accurate, but useless. Their carefully planned operations failed for reasons they could not understand. On the agricultural world of New Montana, Keltharian ground forces attempted to deploy biological weapons that should have destroyed human food production. But the weapons did not work as expected. Farm supervisor Lisa Carter and her network of agricultural workers had been quietly modifying crop strains for weeks, making them resistant to the specific biological agents that Keltharian intelligence had identified as most effective against human agriculture. The aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that had somehow anticipated their weapons and prepared countermeasures, but there was no record of any government scientist or military researcher working on such modifications. The changes had been implemented by farmers who understood their crops better than any laboratory specialist. On the trading station Crossroads, Keltharian infiltrators attempted to seize control of the station's communication and power systems. But Maintenance Chief Pete Williams and his team had been systematically modifying those systems for weeks, creating hidden backup networks, and installing subtle sabotage devices that activated when alien technology tried to interface with human equipment. Every time the Keltharians thought they had taken control of a critical system, it would malfunction in ways that seemed random, but were actually carefully planned. Power would fluctuate just enough to disrupt their equipment. Communication channels would suffer interference that blocked their signals, but allowed human transmissions to continue. Life support systems would develop problems that forced the aliens to retreat from areas they had planned to occupy. Back on the Aurora's edge, Danny's sabotage efforts were having dramatic effects on the Keltharian infiltrators. Their cloaking devices failed at critical moments, leaving them visible to human security teams. Their communication equipment malfunctioned during important coordinations, causing confusion and missed orders. Their computer access devices crashed whenever they tried to penetrate ship systems. The infiltrators knew something was wrong, but they could not figure out what. Their equipment worked perfectly in laboratory tests, but failed constantly when used aboard human ships. They began to suspect that human technology was somehow incompatible with their devices, but they could not understand why. Admiral Hayes, monitoring the battle from the bridge, began receiving reports that confused her. Keltharian forces throughout human space were experiencing equipment failures, communication problems, and supply shortages that their intelligence had not predicted. Enemy fleets were having trouble coordinating their attacks because their long-range communication systems kept malfunctioning. Ground forces were finding that their weapons and equipment worked poorly in human environments. "It's like they're fighting in quicksand," Colonel Morrison reported after his Marines successfully repelled a Keltharian boarding attempt. "Their equipment keeps breaking down, their communications are full of static, and they seem confused about basic things, like ship layouts and system locations." Admiral Hayes did not understand how human forces were achieving such success against an enemy that should have been superior in every way. The Keltharians had better technology, more detailed intelligence, and months of preparation. But somehow, they were losing. What she did not know was that throughout human space, thousands of overlooked workers were waging a quiet war using nothing more than their intimate knowledge of the systems they maintained every day. They were not fighting with weapons or tactics that appeared in any military manual. They were fighting by making sure that human civilization continued to function while alien technology failed. Danny Rodriguez, checking atmospheric readings in Section C7 of the Aurora's Edge, smiled as he watched another group of Keltharian infiltrators retreat from an area where their equipment had mysteriously stopped working. They still did not know he existed, and that was exactly how he wanted it. The war was being won by people no one had bothered to count as soldiers. And the enemy would never see them coming because they had been invisible all along. 3 days into the war, Admiral Hayes stood in her command center staring at reports that made no sense. The Keltharian assault should have succeeded within the first 24 hours. Their intelligence was perfect, their technology was superior, and their tactics had worked against every other species they had conquered. But instead of victory, the aliens were experiencing failures throughout human space. "Admiral, I'm getting reports of coordinated equipment failures across 17 Keltharian fleet groups," her intelligence officer reported. "Their communication systems are suffering interference that follows patterns we can't identify. Their cloaking technology is malfunctioning at precisely the worst moments for their operations." Admiral Hayes studied the tactical displays showing human and alien positions throughout the galaxy. "Are we jamming their communications?" "No, ma'am. Our electronic warfare units report that they are not implementing any jamming protocols. The interference appears to be coming from sources we cannot identify." Colonel Morrison entered the command center with a puzzled expression. "Admiral, I need to report something strange. My Marines have been finding Keltharian infiltrators throughout the ship, but they keep discovering them in areas where our security sensors are not working properly. It's like someone else is hunting them and leaving them for us to find." Admiral Hayes turned to her chief engineer. "What about these system malfunctions the Keltharians are experiencing? Could our equipment be somehow incompatible with their technology?" The chief engineer shook his head. Their technology is more advanced than ours in every way. There's no reason it should malfunction in our environment. If anything, their equipment should work better than our own systems. As the reports continued to arrive, Admiral Hayes began to notice a pattern. The Keltharian failures were not random. They happened at exactly the right moments to give human forces maximum advantage. Communication systems failed when the aliens were trying to coordinate important operations. Cloaking devices stopped working when they were trying to avoid human detection. Weapon systems malfunctioned during critical battles. "It's too convenient," she said finally. "Someone is helping us, but not through official channels." That afternoon, Admiral Hayes called a meeting with her senior staff to review everything. They knew about the mysterious failures affecting Keltharian forces. As they discussed the various incidents, her communications officer mentioned something that caught her attention. "Admiral, there have been unusual patterns in our internal maintenance communications over the past several weeks. Nothing that would normally require attention, but some of our night shift workers have been exchanging technical information more frequently than usual." Admiral Hayes felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. "Show me those communications." For the next hour, she and her staff reviewed maintenance logs, technical reports, and routine system checks performed by the Aurora's Edge's night shift workers. What they found was a pattern of coordinated activity that had been invisible to normal security monitoring. "Danny Rodriguez, Environmental Systems," the Admiral read from a personnel file. "Amy Foster, Communications Monitoring. Nick Chen, Cargo, Bay Operations. Kate Thompson, Medical Logistics." She looked up at her staff. These 4 people have been in contact with similar workers throughout human space, and their communications correlate exactly with the timing of Keltharian equipment failures. Colonel Morrison frowned. "Are you suggesting that maintenance workers are somehow sabotaging alien technology?" "I'm suggesting that people who understand our systems better than anyone else might be able to disrupt enemy operations in ways we never considered." Admiral Hayes made a decision that went against every military protocol she had learned. Instead of calling Danny and his team to her office for an official debriefing, she went to find them herself. She found Danny in Section C7, checking atmospheric readings just like he did every night. He looked surprised when Admiral Hayes appeared in the maintenance corridor, but he did not seem nervous or guilty. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, "I think we need to talk." Danny straightened up and looked directly at her. "Yes, ma'am. I've been expecting this conversation." Admiral Hayes studied his face. "You know why I'm here. You figured out that some of us have been working on the Keltharian problem." Danny replied. "I'm not surprised. You're good at your job, and we've been affecting things on a pretty large scale. How long have you known about the infiltrators?" "About 3 weeks. I found them by accident while doing routine system checks. Their presence changed the atmospheric readings in ways that our security sensors didn't detect. But I noticed because I've been reading those numbers for 20 years. Admiral Hayes felt a mixture of admiration and frustration. "Why didn't you report this to security?" Danny considered his answer carefully. "Because I figured that if they got past all our official security measures, they probably had ways of monitoring our official communications. I thought it would be better to handle the problem quietly. And you recruited other workers to help you. I contacted people who understand ship systems the way I do. People who notice when things are not quite right, even when the problems are too small for computer systems to detect." Admiral Hayes understood the logic, but the implications made her uncomfortable. "Mr. Rodriguez, you and your team have been conducting unauthorized operations that have affected a major military conflict. I should have you all arrested." Danny nodded. "I understand that, ma'am, but I hope you won't." "Why shouldn't I?" "Because we're winning," Danny said simply. "And if you bring us into the official military structure, we'll stop being effective." Admiral Hayes asked him to explain, and Danny told her something that changed her understanding of the entire war. "The Keltharians are really good at studying hierarchies and command structures," he said. "They figured out how our military works, how our government works, and how our economy works. But they never bothered to study how our civilization actually functions on a day-to-day basis." He gestured toward the maintenance corridor around them. "They know about admirals and colonels and politicians, But they don't know about the people who keep the air clean, the lights on, and the food moving. We're invisible to them because we're not important in their kind of society. Danny explained that the Keltharians came from a highly stratified empire, where status and authority determined everything. They literally could not perceive threats that did not come from recognized power structures. In their society, someone like me would never be trusted with anything important. They can't imagine that humans would put critical systems under the control of ordinary workers, so they never planned for the possibility that ordinary workers might fight back. Admiral Hayes began to understand. You're saying that your effectiveness depends on remaining outside the official command structure. Exactly. The moment you promote us or give us official recognition, we become visible to their intelligence systems. They'll start tracking us and planning countermeasures. Right now they're losing because they're fighting an enemy they can't see. Admiral Hayes spent the next several hours talking with Danny, Amy, Nick, and Kate. She learned that their network now included thousands of workers throughout human space, all of them coordinating resistance efforts through channels that looked like routine job communications. We're not heroes, Kate explained. We're just people doing our jobs, but we've figured out how to do our jobs in ways that make it impossible for the Keltharians to succeed. Amy showed Admiral Hayes the communication patterns they had developed. We pass intelligence through maintenance schedules, supply requests, and technical reports. To anyone monitoring our communications, it looks like ordinary work traffic. Nick explained how they were disrupting Keltharian supply lines. We're not attacking their ships directly. We're making sure that critical supplies end up in the wrong places at the wrong times. Their invasion plans depend on precise logistics, and we're introducing just enough chaos to make those plans fail. Admiral Hayes realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in military history. An entire civilization was defending itself using resources that did not appear in any strategic analysis or tactical manual. "What do you need from me?" she asked finally. Danny smiled. "Nothing, ma'am, just let us keep doing our jobs. And don't tell anyone we exist," Amy added. "The moment this becomes official, we lose our biggest advantage." Admiral Hayes made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. She returned to her command center and issued orders that Danny Rodriguez and his team were to be classified as essential personnel, do not transfer without consultation. She also made sure that their activities would be protected from official scrutiny, but she did not promote them, recognize them publicly, or integrate them into military command structures. She left them exactly where they were most effective, invisible, overlooked, and quietly winning a war that most people did not even know was being fought. 6 months after the war began, the Keltharian Empire did something it had never done in 3 centuries of conquest. It asked for peace talks. Danny Rodriguez was checking water filtration systems in Section B9 when the announcement came over the ship's intercom. Admiral Hayes's voice echoed through the corridors, informing the crew that Keltharian representatives wanted to negotiate an end to hostilities. Danny smiled as he made notes on his tablet. The water filters were working perfectly, just like everything else he maintained. The war had not ended with dramatic space battles or heroic ground assaults. Instead, it had slowly ground to a halt as Keltharian forces found themselves unable to maintain operations in human space. Their supply lines had become unreliable. Their communication systems suffered constant interference. Their advanced technology malfunctioned whenever they tried to use it against human targets. Most importantly, their intelligence networks had become useless. The Keltharians had spent years learning about human military forces, government structures, and economic systems. But none of that knowledge helped them when they found themselves fighting an enemy that operated completely outside those structures. Danny had watched the gradual collapse of Keltharian operations through reports from his network of overlooked workers throughout human space. Agricultural Supervisor Lisa Carter on New Montana reported that alien ground forces had abandoned their attempts to destroy human food production after their biological weapons proved ineffective against crops that had been quietly modified by farmers who understood their plants better than any laboratory scientist. Maintenance Chief Pete Williams on Crossroads Station described how Keltharian infiltrators had given up trying to take control of critical systems After weeks of equipment failures that seemed random but were actually carefully orchestrated by workers who knew every pipe, wire, and circuit in their facility. Medical orderly Kate Thompson had tracked the alien retreat through her monitoring of medical supply requests. Keltharian forces throughout human space were requesting increasing amounts of medical equipment to treat injuries caused not by human weapons, but by their own malfunctioning technology and failed operations. The peace talks took place on a neutral space station near the border between human and Keltharian territory. Admiral Hayes led the human delegation, but she insisted that the negotiations include representatives from groups that the Keltharians had never considered important. Danny found himself aboard a diplomatic shuttle heading to the peace conference, wearing civilian clothes that felt strange after months of working in maintenance coveralls. Amy, Nick, and Kate were with him, along with agricultural supervisors, communication technicians, medical personnel, and maintenance workers from throughout human space. "I still can't believe they want to talk to us," Amy said as their shuttle approached the station. "They don't have a choice," Nick replied. "They finally figured out that we're the reason their invasion failed." The conference room was divided between the official delegations from both sides, but also included what the Keltharians called technical consultants. Danny realized that the aliens had spent months trying to understand why their operations had failed, and they had eventually traced the problems back to the networks of ordinary workers who kept human civilization functioning. The Keltharian lead negotiator was a tall, gray-skinned alien named Zeth Ka, who spoke perfect English but seemed confused by basic human social structures. Danny watched him study the human delegation with obvious puzzlement. "We do not understand," Zeth Ka said during the first session. "Your military forces are inferior to ours. Your technology is less advanced. Your government structures are inefficient compared to our imperial system. By all logical analysis, we should have conquered your territory within days." Admiral Hayes gestured toward Danny and the other overlooked workers. "You were fighting the wrong enemy." Zeth Ka looked at Danny with something like bewilderment. "This individual is listed in your records as an environmental maintenance worker. His authority level is minimal. His access to strategic resources is limited. How could someone in his position affect military operations across multiple star systems?" Danny stood up and walked to the conference room's display screen. With Admiral Hayes's permission, he showed the Keltharians a diagram of how human civilization actually worked. "You studied our admirals, our politicians, and our business leaders," Danny said. "But you never looked at the people who keep the lights on, the air clean, and the food moving. You assumed that only people with official authority could affect important things." He pointed to different parts of the diagram. "But human society doesn't work that way. We trust ordinary people with critical responsibilities because we learned a long time ago that civilizations survive through the work of everyone, not just the people at the top." Danny explained that every human colony and space station included thousands of workers like himself, people whose jobs required them to understand complex systems intimately. These people formed networks of competence that existed parallel to official power structures. "When you attacked us, you thought you were fighting our military," Danny continued. "But you were actually fighting our entire civilization. Every maintenance worker, every farm supervisor, every communications technician, every medical orderly. People who know how to make things work, and who also know how to make things stop working." Zeth Ka was quiet for a long moment. "This is unprecedented. In our experience, conquered species depend on centralized authority structures. When we eliminate their leaders and take control of their key systems, resistance collapses. That's because you've been fighting hierarchical societies like your own," Kate explained. "Human civilization is different. We organize ourselves around necessary work, not just authority. You can't defeat us by capturing our leaders because our real strength comes from millions of people you never bothered to count as important." The negotiations continued for weeks, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The Keltharians had built their empire by conquering species that organized themselves the way they did, with rigid hierarchies and centralized control. They had no experience fighting an enemy that drew strength from distributed competence rather than concentrated authority. More importantly, They realized that even if they somehow managed to defeat human military forces, they would still face the problem of governing human territories. How do you control a civilization that depends on the voluntary cooperation of millions of ordinary workers? How do you rule people whose most critical skills belong to individuals you can't even identify? The final peace agreement included terms that surprised everyone. The Keltharians not only agreed to end their invasion of human space, but also requested permission to send observers to study human social structures. They wanted to understand how a civilization could function effectively without rigid hierarchical control. In exchange, they offered to share some of their advanced technology with humans, particularly in areas like space travel and energy production. But they also asked for something unusual. They wanted human advisors to help them reform their own imperial system. "We have conquered 17 species over the past 3 centuries, Zeth-Ka explained during the final negotiating session. But we have never encountered a civilization that remained strong because of its ordinary citizens rather than despite them. This suggests that our imperial model may be incomplete." Danny found the idea of helping to reform an alien empire both fascinating and terrifying. But he also understood that it might be the best way to ensure lasting peace. If the Keltharians learned to value distributed competence over centralized authority, they might stop trying to conquer other species. 5 years later, Danny was back on the Aurora's edge, checking atmospheric recyclers during the night shift. His personnel file now included a note that he was essential personnel, do not transfer without consultation, but otherwise his life had returned to normal. He maintained environmental systems, wrote reports about air quality and water filtration, and occasionally trained new workers who were assigned to his department. The only difference was that some of his trainees were Keltharian exchange students who wanted to learn about human maintenance procedures. Danny found them eager to understand the technical details of life support systems, but they struggled with the concept that such critical work was entrusted to individuals with no formal authority. "In our society, only high-ranking officials would be permitted to control systems this important," one young Keltharian had told him. "That's probably why your systems break down more often than ours do," Danny had replied. "The people who use the systems every day are usually the best at maintaining them." As Danny finished his shift and headed back to his quarters, he reflected on how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The war was over, peace had been established, and humans were beginning to explore former Keltharian territories. But the real victory had not come from superior weapons or brilliant strategies. It had come from ordinary people doing necessary work with extraordinary dedication. Danny understood that this would always be humanity's greatest strength.